These targets will require councils to live zone feasible development capacity to provide for at least 30 years of housing demand at any one time. Let's just unpick that a bit. Live zoning means to provide for housing to be enabled. In other words, the land can be used for housing in a plan that is legally operative and in effect. And feasible development capacity means housing capacity that is commercially viable for a developer to build at a profit. So how does this differ from the status quo? Well, currently the MPSUD requires councils to plan for at least 30 years of housing demand, but it only requires councils to live zone feasible development capacity to meet 3 years of demand at any one time. So we're changing the requirement to make councils live zone 30 years of development capacity and make it available right now. In effect, this will flood the market with opportunities for development and over time drive down land prices and the cost of housing. Councils are required to prepare housing and business development capacity assessments. Here's another acronym for you. These are known as HBAs, at least every 3 years. And these set out projected demand and business land and calculate the development capacity enabled in their plans to meet this. Now, right now, councils have quite a lot of discretion about the inputs into these assessments. In central government, we need confidence that demand for housing is not being understated or that the amount of available and feasible development capacity is not being overstated. So we'll therefore be requiring councils to use the high demand projections in their assessments and also strengthening the requirements and guidance for how councils model how much capacity is live zoned and feasible. We also need much greater information about how urban land markets are functioning, such as the measures of urban fringe land price differentials or price-cost ratios. We'll therefore be setting new requirements that price indicators do not deteriorate and ideally improve over time as a measure of how well land markets are functioning, accompanied by enforcement powers for central government. That's number one. Second new change is new rules requiring cities to be allowed to expand outwards at the urban fringe. Now, some people say that to solve the housing crisis, all you need to do is allow more density in cities. Some people say you just need more urban expansion through greenfield growth. And the truth is, we need both. Cities should grow up and out. The economics of development should guide what happens rather than planning rules. Where there are abundant development opportunities, developers and ultimately house buyers will dictate the scale, pace and location of development. Now, the MPSUD requires councils to prepare future development strategies at the moment, another acronym, FDSs, which are long-term spatial plans. These are meant to identify broad locations in which growth will be enabled and the infrastructure required to service that growth and any constraints on development. However, practically, they haven't delivered what was promised. And there's a perception, I think a fair one, that they've tended to stifle development on the edge of our cities rather than enable it. So we're going to look to improve the future development strategy requirements to ensure that the strategies are more responsive to development opportunities and actually enable more housing in both greenfields and brownfields areas. We're also going to work towards embedding an effective right to build on the city fringe on the condition that the infrastructure costs of new development are covered. In other words, where growth pays for growth. My aim is that councils are not able to turn down a development on the grounds that the perceived demand isn't there or that the infrastructure costs are too high. In addition, councils will no longer be able to impose rural-urban boundaries in their planning documents. This doesn't mean they can't have land zoned for rural use, but it does mean they can't set hard regulatory boundaries that constrain growth. Many political parties and many governments over many years have said they would do this. Our government will be the one to deliver it. There's further work to be done on urban expansion, and it's obviously very closely connected to our work on infrastructure funding and financing, and on this particular topic I'll have more to say by the end of the year. The third change we're making is a strengthening of the intensification provisions in the MPSUD. So this is a series of changes around where councils must enable intensification to ensure that the capacity that's enabled is in locations where there's demand and that are well connected to businesses, services and transportation. We've developed a package of liberalisation and deregulatory measures that will collectively make it easier to build housing across our cities and enhance the rights of property owners. There's quite a few big changes here. We'll restore the MPSUD baseline intensification requirements to their original position. Now, this is complicated, but Prior to the MDRS being introduced, Policy 3D of the MPSUD required Tier 1 councils to deregulate to enable heights and densities commensurate with levels of demand and accessibility to businesses and services across all of their urban areas. This requirement was narrowed when the MDRS came in, arguably because it made it redundant, but with making the MDRS optional, this no longer applies, and so we're going to return Policy 3D back to its original scope. We will strengthen density requirements around transit corridors. Currently, the requirement is to enable at least 6-storey development around rapid transit, and this only applies to Auckland and Greater Wellington's rail networks and Auckland's Northern Busway. We will go further and also specify density requirements around strategic transit corridors. Councils will be responsible for determining these corridors, subject to criteria set by central government. We're going to simplify the definition of rapid transit to address the alleged ambiguity in the current definition. The interminable and frankly boring debate in Wellington over whether the Johnsonville train line is rapid transit was time-consuming, expensive and frustrating. We'll probably just simply list the metropolitan train lines and busways that trigger upzoning while future-proofing for new lines and busways that are being developed. We will clarify the definition of walkable catchments in the context of centre zones and rapid transit. Now, councils are currently required to upzone within a walkable catchment of centre zones and rapid transit, but there's been significant debate about what is walkable, leading to costs and inefficiencies in plan changes. We'll set minimum catchment sizes that councils must use, with catchment sizes based on the level of service provided by the type of centre or the node. This means, for example, there'll be larger catchment sizes for city and metropolitan centres than around rapid transit stops. We're also going to clarify the rules around qualifying matters. Councils are not required to implement the intensification provisions of the MPSUD in particular areas if a qualifying matter, for example a risk of flooding, makes intensification inappropriate in those areas. These are basically permitted exemptions to intensification. However, some councils have misused those exemptions, relying on unlisted exemptions without sufficiently justifying why they actually make intensification inappropriate and not undertaking site-specific detailed analysis. We're therefore going to clarify that decision makers must explicitly consider the process and evidentiary requirements in their decisions to use a qualifying matter to reduce density. This will ensure that decision makers must engage with the economic evidence and the trade-offs that using qualifying matters entails and test the robustness of evidence provided in reaching their conclusions. We'll also require that the loss of development capacity through use of an unlisted qualifying matter, including special character, is offset by a direct and corresponding increase in development capacity elsewhere. This reflects the view that local impacts can be managed without limiting the overall supply of housing. Fourth change is new rules for mixed-use development. Now, mixed-use development refers to enabling different types of activities that happen in proximity to each other. The greatest cities in the world, London, New York, Sydney, Paris, they all have areas that contain a mix of housing, supermarkets, cafes and offices, and there's no reason we can't have the same here. Our cities need to look and grow the way that people actually want to live, not the way a tidy-minded planner in a council cubicle think people should live. Mixed-use development promotes productivity and competition. It supports efficient land use. It makes a range of services more accessible and it creates safer and more vibrant neighbourhoods and cities. So we will issue national direction requiring Tier 1 and 2 councils to enable a baseline of mixed use across their urban areas. This might include, for example, allowing small-scale activities such as dairies and cafes to operate anywhere within urban areas, or activities of a greater scale if communities wish for this to occur. On top of this, we will also require Tier 1 councils to enable small to mid-scale activities like cafes and restaurants, retail, metro-style supermarkets and offices in areas subject to the MPSUD 6-storey or greater intensification requirements. Put together collectively, these changes will mean much more livable, connected and functional cities. We need more apartment buildings with cafes and supermarkets in the bottom. We need small bodegas and boutiques and cafes in the type of environments that New Zealanders often travel overseas and come home and say, why can't we be like that here? And my message to New Zealanders is we can, and we're going to change the planning system to make sure that that can happen. There's more. Fifth change, we're going to abolish minimum floor areas and balcony requirements. Now, some councils set minimum floor areas and balcony requirements which can significantly increase the cost of new apartments and limit the supply of lower cost apartments. In some cases, this can make developments just uneconomic or push the cost of housing outside the reach of first home buyers. Evidence from 2015 shows that in the Auckland market, for example, balcony size requirements increase the cost of an apartment by $40,000 to $70,000 per unit, and minimum apartment sizes result in fewer lower cost dwellings being developed, and these costs will only have increased over the last decade. We will therefore remove the ability for councils to set rules or guidelines that require balconies or floor areas to be of a minimum size. This will increase housing supply by enabling more homes to be built at a cheaper price point, and most importantly, reduce the demand for inferior informal accommodation. Developers will still be able to size dwellings and choose to provide balconies as they and their customers see fit, provided they comply with national building standards. Now, you sometimes hear people complain about all of these shoebox apartments, and I agree, they're not the right housing solution for everyone. But do you know what's smaller than a shoebox apartment? Cars and tents that people are living in right now in New Zealand. So this will help increase the supply of housing. Young people need affordable ways into the housing market. Students and young professionals often want smaller, low maintenance, affordable dwellings that are near to their jobs and transport connections. So these changes, alongside our granny flat rule changes that we announced a couple of weeks ago, will enable more choice in our housing market, and that's a good thing. Sixthly, to finish off, we are going to introduce new provisions to make the MDRS optional for councils, as I mentioned, as part of our coalition agreement with the ACT Party. Fair to say this is not a simple undertaking. The MDRS were passed in 2021 and councils are implementing them at the same time as the MPSUD requirements. Different councils are at different stages. As of today, 8 of the 15 councils required to implement the MDRS have done so, including Wellington. 7 councils, including here in Auckland, Hamilton and Christchurch, have not yet completed their plan changes. So we do need to move quickly to provide certainty for councils, developers and the community. So here's how it will work. We're going to require in legislation that all councils currently required to implement the MDRS must carry out a ratification vote to determine whether or not they plan to retain, alter or remove the MDRS from their urban areas. Councils will then notify me and the Minister for the Environment of their decision in writing. For councils that have already completed their MPSUD and MDRS changes, if the council chooses to alter or remove the MDRS in their ratification vote, then they must start work to progress a plan change that gives effect to this. We will amend the RMA so that a variation of the streamlined planning process is mandatory for councils who vote to remove or alter the MDRS. This is a faster plan change process than the RMA standard plan change process, and provides for central government oversight and approval of their plan changes. When they do the plan change to remove or alter the MDRS, they must give effect to the relevant housing growth targets, the intensification changes and the direction on mixed use through the same plan change they used to remove the MDRS. For councils that have completed the MPSUD and MDRS changes and that vote to retain the MDRS, then nothing will change. I'm doing further work to develop a sensible process and time frame for implementation of the other important changes, the housing growth targets, the intensification changes and the mixed use changes. For councils that are midway through their plan changes, like Auckland, the circumstances will differ for each council. Each council will still be required to vote on the use of MDRS, and it may be that we need a bespoke pathway for plan changes for each council to implement our housing growth targets and the intensification changes and the mixed use changes, and we'll work through each of those situations with the relevant councils in good faith. What I've talked about today is just the start. Today's changes deal with land use rules and they'll help create competitive urban land markets, but there's a lot of work to do on infrastructure funding and financing. Work is underway on that and I'll have more to say later in the year. Long term, my objective is that the cost of infrastructure is not a bottleneck on greenfield or brownfield development. The key to achieving this will be better funding and financing mechanisms. We can, for example, improve the way that we price infrastructure to ensure growth is a benefit for local councils rather than a burden. Infrastructure should earn sufficient lifetime revenue from service charges to recover its whole-of-life costs to the maximum extent possible. Existing communities should not have to subsidise the costs of growth. There are other improvements that we're looking at as well as part of our wider RMA reform work. We're looking at restrictions on development through the National Policy Statement on Highly Productive Land, for example. We're looking at changes to the National Policy Statement on freshwater management. We're looking at the often slow timeframes for getting a permit through the Wildlife Act, for example, which dates back to 1953. We're looking at heritage rules, which is a particular issue in Wellington. And we're also looking at barriers to building on Maori land. Let me conclude by saying that solving our housing crisis is one of this government's top priorities. Solving our housing crisis will mean a more productive, wealthier and better New Zealand. Today's changes opening up land for development inside and at the edge of our cities will help. But there's so much more to do. I can't wait to get on with it. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions. Sir.
Chris, great news. Lance Johnson from Property Brokers.
Hey.
The highly productive land policy,
Yeah.
that obviously has an effect, particularly on that land close to city fringes, that's the zone rural and can or can't be grown on.
Yeah.
Where are you at with that? Because I understood it was under review.
Yeah.
And the luck levels 1, 2, 3 and 4
Yeah.
were under review as well. So.
Yeah, so we're working away on that. What we're trying to do is strike the right balance between protecting our elite soils, you know, your pukekohe potatoes and parts of the Hawke's Bay, for example, which are extremely highly productive, your tier 1 and 2 soils, but also allowing cities to grow. And so we're just working our way through that, and once we've landed on a policy decision, I'll have more to say. We campaigned on excluding LUC 3 from the restrictions and just keeping it to LUC 1 and 2. So we're looking at that, but we're also looking at the tests that are in the highly productive land rules at the moment. So the way it works at the moment is for LUC 1, 2 and 3 land, you basically have to prove, I would say, a pretty strict test. You have to prove that there's demand for housing before you can actually go on and do it, and there's a whole lot of other restrictions in there as well. So we're just working our way through the types of land classification and also the tests on the land we're talking about as well. So that's it.
Get overturned into Needham, didn't it, just recently?
Yeah, and there's been a recent court case as well around the data that you use, that councils are allowed to use, and that's had there's a recent court case, I think it's called Bluegrass, that's had an outcome that I think people were pretty surprised by. So we just have to take that into account as well. So it's quite complicated, but we're just working our way through that. But we're committed to changes to the MPS HPL to make it easier to build. But it's not just about housing as well. There's a whole lot of things within the highly productive land, things that even farmers want to do that they can't do on the land at the moment. Things like piggeries, for example, have been raised with me, even just building small-scale structures on the land, which I don't think was ever intended by the highly productive land rules. So we're just working our way through all of that at the moment.
Thank you.
Hey Chris, so the Auckland Plan,
Yep.
Unitary Plan identifies 11,000 odd hectares of greenfield land for urbanisation expansion. So
Yep.
when you talk about removing the RUV line, are you moving outside of that 11,000 or enabling that 11,000 in terms of infrastructure? That's basically the bottleneck.
Yeah, so that'll be over to the council exactly how they what they zone for feasible development capacity and operative housing. So what we're trying to do is find the right balance between making it really clear to councils you've got to zone an absolute bucket load of land so that there's abundant development opportunities that people can choose from, and allowing the council choice around how that takes place. So it's not you can only go out at the city fringe or you can only go up. It's about allowing maximum choice and opportunities for people to build and develop. And there'll be a mixture. There'll be more greenfield stuff, there'll be brownfields intensification, there'll be urban regeneration, and there'll be a lot of density in and around our transport corridors. And exactly the mix of that, it's not up to me. That'll be ultimately over to the market. That'll be over to developers, that'll be over to homeowners, be over to the people who do the development. So there will be choices and the economics will change over time as well. So that's the great thing about the market. It delivers on people's own needs and wants. But at the moment, what we've got is a situation where we've got very restrictive zoning rules in many parts of the country. The AUP was a big step forward, so I don't want to bag the AUP too much. Like, that was a big step forward, and the economic evidence is really clear that the AUP did deregulate quite a bit in Auckland, has provided for more development opportunities. It has lowered rents relative to what it would otherwise be. There's some really interesting research out from the University of Auckland, for example, that shows that rents are appreciably lower in Auckland compared to other parts of the country as a result of the AUP. So I don't want to bag the AUP. What we're saying is that we just need to take that next step and also allow expansion at the fringe. The reason why expansion at the fringe is important is that, and again, there's a lot of economic evidence around this. Eric Crampton's research, for example, who was part of our housing expert group that helped us put this policy together, he would point you to the fact that the urban-rural land differential at the fringe, so the increased land prices inside the cordon that you can build, rather than the prices outside where you can't build, all of that actually flows through to house prices across the rest of the city. So in other words, people are paying more for apartments and terraced housing and duplexes inside Auckland because the urban land rural differential at the fringe is so marked. Those prices suffuse themselves through to the market. So allowing almost like the safety valve at the fringe is really important in anchoring land prices throughout the rest of the city. So all the pieces work together, and that's what we're trying to accomplish as quite a comprehensive solution for Auckland, but not just Auckland, although you're very important too, but everywhere else as well. Yeah.
Chris, to enable industrial or commercial land holdings,
Yep.
we're actually got a shortage
Yep.
down the north of areas to build. Now, is that going to free up once we get the housing and the infrastructure around there, or can we sort of do it the other way, where we've actually got somewhere where people would need to work and then build around that?
So I think it's a bit of both, to be honest. So the housing the capacity assessments that the councils are required to do also involves commercial and industrial to some extent as well, and we'll work our way through exactly what the requirements will be in relation to that. I've signalled today changes to the way in which they work for residential land, but equally keen to look at how it works for commercial as well. But I would say to you, the changes we're going to make around mixed-use zoning will have a real effect as well. It will result in quite a liberalisation of the way in which the city zoning works. So, the problem is, for years we've had this mentality driven by the planners that you live here in your suburban, 3-bedroom house, and you work over here in your office or your factory or whatever, and you go shopping over here, and then you just drive around, and that's how you live your life. So it's not actually how people live their lives. Not in the modern world, maybe in the 1950s, but in 2024, particularly with our very diverse and different populations, particularly in Auckland, this is not how people live their lives. And it's not how people want to live their lives when they're given choices. So for some people, in their 20s, it'll be living near a train station because they take the train to uni or work or whatever. They don't necessarily need a massive apartment. They don't necessarily need a car park. They want to take the train or take the bus. They want to be able to go out at night and walk home after a big night out on K Road or whatever. They want to be able to go to a cafe and get a coffee in the morning. They want to be able to do their shopping and not have to drive to a supermarket 20 kilometres away. They want to be able to go to a metro supermarket. They want to be able to go out at night and enjoy what living in a city is like. And look, there's parts of Auckland like that now, but I want many more parts of Auckland and other parts of the country to be like that as well. So I want to facilitate choice. Let's get away from the idea that planners can plan our cities and let actual individuals and families decide how they live their lives. That's ultimately what society is all about. It's made up of individuals and families making thousands, millions, billions of decisions every day, every hour, and every year. And collectively, if we just let people make choices, that will result in better outcomes. That's my strong view, and that's what we're trying to do today. Who's going to break the ice with a final question?
Maybe one.
Go for it.
Hey, congratulations to you and your team, by the way, getting to this stage. Just a thought, are incentives for the development of private sector to kick this whole thing in the air once it's all opened up?
Not at this point. What we are considering is incentives for councils to go for growth. So I call it the housing trifecta. You've got the land stuff, which I talked about today. You've got the infrastructure funding and financing that's really important. I signalled a bit of direction there, but we're doing some more work on that. And then the third bit is incentives for councils to make sure that the political economy of growth changes away from hostility towards an embrace of growth. And so we've got this coalition agreement with the ACT Party to consider GST sharing for councils. We campaigned on a slightly different policy. Exactly what we go for and how it works, we're just working through at the moment. But there will be a revenue stream to councils tied to housing. And so that's really important. And it's very popular with local government. They are constantly pressing me for when they'll find out answers. As you know, there's the Crown is fiscally constrained at the moment. I think everyone's aware of our budgetary situation. And so we're just working our way through that. And so that's the kind of third pillar of what I was talking about. So we'll work our way through that. And individual councils may wish to do, different incentives for different types of developments and things like that. Those are fundamentally local matters, but there won't be a kind of central government direct incentive for developers. But what we will be doing is providing a financial stream to councils. We just haven't worked out the precise mechanism for what that will be yet. There's a range of different policy options, and it's important to get it right. So we're just working our way through that at the moment.
Great.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.